Well, I was at a friend's house, and it was breakfast time. And so he poured a bowl of cereal for his daughter and set it on the table. She picked up the spoon, took a bite, and suddenly exclaimed, "The milk is hot!" She was little. She was probably about 3 and probably didn't have the words to explain what she was experiencing, but the milk had gone sour. It was bad. But the thing is, you know what? Food does that. Food will go bad. It will spoil. And that's why we have expiration dates on food. But there are many things, like food, that don't last. There are things that come to an end. Things that we do in life, things that we pursue in life will come to an end. Businesses and organizations come to ends. Even governments and nations and kingdoms come to the ends. But there are some things that will last forever. What will last? We're going to find that answer later. But today we come to the end of Judah's time in the land before they're sent out into exile. We've seen this in several parts of Jeremiah as we've gone through Jeremiah, but the last chapter of 2 Chronicles sums up their experience here. And there's something bad or wrong that happened while Jerusalem was being destroyed and the people of Judah were being carried off into exile. And the book of Obadiah tells about that. Obadiah is a short book. It's only 1 chapter. And so we're going to wrap up Chronicles, and then we're going to jump over and go through Obadiah this morning. And so 2 Chronicles chapter 36, beginning in verse 5. It says, Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. Against him came up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and bound him in chains to take him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried part of the vessels of the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his palace in Babylon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and the abominations that he did and what was found against him, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah, and Jehoiakim, his son, reigned in his place. So Jehoiakim's father was the good king Josiah, the one who repaired the temple and carried out many reforms there in Jerusalem and Judah, getting rid of all the idolatry. But Jehoiakim is not like his father. In fact, we're told here, he did evil. During Jehoiakim's reign, Egypt and Babylon were battling for control of the region. But eventually Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon won out, and they forced Judah to submit to them. But then, a few years later, Jehoiakim rebelled against Babylon, against Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar came down and removed him as king. And at the same time, he took some valuable things from the temple and took them home to put in his own house, in the palace. Let's keep reading. Verse 9. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. In the spring of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar sent and brought him to Babylon with the precious vessels of the house of the Lord, and made him his brother Zedekiah king over Judah and Jerusalem. So Jehoiakim was taken out, and now Jehoiakim is made king. Jehoiakim is also known as Jeconiah and Coniah. And we saw those names as we've studied through here. But Jehoiakim is made king. But after only 3 months, he surrenders to Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, he is the king. We're told that he did evil, but he is the king who God had said through the prophet Jeremiah that he would rip him off his finger like a signet ring and throw it away. And so he was going to remove him. And God also said that neither he nor his descendants would be king. But then we also saw in our study that in Haggai, that God ended his curse against Jehoiakim's descendants and restored his family line through Zerubbabel. And in the last chapter of Jeremiah we saw last week, we read that Jehoiakim was released from prison, and the king of Babylon treated him like he was a king. Let's keep reading, verse 11. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. He did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke from the mouth of the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God. He stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to the Lord, the God of Israel. All the officers, let me stop there. So after Jehoiakim surrenders to Nebuchadnezzar, Zedekiah was made king. He is the last king of Judah. And so he also did evil, and we saw this specifically in that he refused to humbly listen to God. He refused to listen to Jeremiah, God's prophet. And he also then rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar brought the Babylon army down against him and against Jerusalem. Now let's keep reading. Verse 14. All the officers of the priests and the people likewise were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. And they polluted the house of the Lord that he had made holy in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his word and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore, he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand. And all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and his princes, and all these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. Okay, so this simply summarizes up the last years of Judah and Jerusalem, leading up to the exile. But at the end, it talks about Jeremiah's prophecy being fulfilled and the land enjoying its Sabbaths. The exile in Babylon lasted until the Persians came and conquered Babylon and took over their empire. But in Jeremiah 29:10, Jeremiah had said that the exile would last 70 years. And 70 years would make up for about 500 years worth of Sabbath years. And what do I mean by that? Well, keep your finger in Chronicles and look back at Leviticus. It's the third book in the Bible. Leviticus chapter 25. Beginning in verse 1. This is part of the law that God gave to the Israelites. He says, the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. Okay, so just like the week has 6 days and then a 7th day of a day of rest, he said the land was supposed to have the same thing. But for 6 years they would work the land, and on the 7th year, they would let it rest, just let it lay fallow. And whatever grew, but they weren't to work the land, okay? And he says, you shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you, for yourself and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired workers, and the sojourner or foreigner who lives with you, and for your cattle, and for the wild animals that are in the land. All its yield shall be for food. So the thing is that when they didn't work the land, some plants would still grow. And so there would still be fruit, there would still be some vegetables or grain in the fields, but they weren't to go harvest it. They were just to pick whatever they needed, whenever they needed it for food. Anyone could pick anything and eat anything that was growing in the fields or in the land. And so they were supposed to give the land a year of rest. But apparently they never kept that law. They never did it. And so now, during the exile, now the land is getting its rest that it had never been given because of the many years of Israel's unfaithfulness to God. And now there's one last paragraph back in Chronicles that tells us the ending, about the ending of the exile. Verse 22 says, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, or Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. So this is like a preview. It looks forward to the end of the exile and the return of the people to the land and the rebuilding of the temple. And so God raises up Cyrus, the king of Persia, and he has Cyrus allow the people to go home. But not only that, he tells them, go home and build the temple, because God's told me to have the temple built. And so we have this preview, but why put this little preview here? Well, it's to make a point. God isn't done. All right? He's not done working through Israel. His promises will be kept. The king that he promised will come, and he will deliver God's people, and he will reign from Jerusalem, and all the people from all the nations, and people from all the nations will come to him and learn from him and worship him. But now, let's turn over to the book of Obadiah. So it's to the right, several books. So you're going to go past Psalms and past Isaiah. It's between the books of Amos and Jonah. It's really small, so you can easily pass over it. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. So Obadiah. And Obadiah is a prophecy of judgment against the Edomites, or Edom. It's very similar to what we saw last week in the end of Jeremiah, the prophecies of judgment that we saw in Jeremiah. So Obadiah, verse 1, says, the vision of Obadiah. Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom, we have heard a report from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent among the nations. Rise up, let us rise up against her for battle. So this introduction begins by telling us that this prophecy was given through Obadiah the prophet, and it's about Edom. God has a message against Edom. And so we want to ask the question first, who is Edom? Or who are the Edomites? Well, they are the descendants of Esau, or Jacob's brother, twin brother, Esau. And this means that they are distant relatives of the Israelites. The Edomites are mentioned several times in the Old Testament, and a lot of times their relationship to Israel is highlighted. For example, in Deuteronomy 23:7, God says to Israel, you shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. He's your relative. Also, in Numbers 20, verses 14 through 21, it tells of when the Edomites refused to allow the Israelites to pass through their territory. So when they were, it was after they had come out of Egypt, and before they entered into the land and they were wandering in the wilderness, they requested to pass through the territory of the Edomites. And they said, we'll just stick to the highway. We won't go out, we won't take your stuff, or we won't ruin anything. We'll just stick to the highway. And the Edomites said, no. And they wouldn't let them do it. So that's who the Edomites are. But why are they called Edomites then? If they're the descendants of Esau, why are they not called Esauites or something like that? Well, there's a reason for it. But anyways, the interesting thing is the word Edom sounds very similar to the Hebrew word for the color red. Okay, so it's kind of like the difference of Edom or Adom. Okay, so it sounds very similar. So there's a connection, though, between Esau and the color red. What's the connection between Esau and the color red? Well, there's a few things. So first of all, when Esau was born, we are told that he came out what? Reddish or red. Okay, it's probably a reference to his hair, that he had red hair, and we know that he was very hairy. Okay, and so he was red. Also, in Genesis 25, verse 30, it says this. Esau said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stew. This is when Jacob was kind of, Esau's been out in the field hunting. He comes in, he's hungry, and he wants something to eat. And Jacob says, give me your birthright, and I'll give you some soup. So this is it. He says, give me some of that red stew, for I am exhausted. And then there's a parenthetical statement that says, therefore, his name was called Edom. All right, so we see the connection coming together. Then, also, the place where the Edomites live is rocky, and the rocks have a reddish tone to them, and it was called Edom. All right, but looking here at verse 1, there's something a little confusing here. The verse starts by saying, this is what God says about Edom, but then that message doesn't start until verse 2. But the intro continues on, and it says that there's a group of people who say they've heard a message. And a messenger has been sent to the nations telling them to rise up for battle and fight against the Edomites. So there's a couple things here that aren't totally clear. Like, who is this group that heard the message? It appears to be the prophet Obadiah and the other Israelites who are there with them. But also, who is this messenger? Well, there's a couple possibilities. It could be the prophet, Obadiah, and if so, then the message is what we find in the rest of this book. Or it could be a messenger from some other enemy of Edom who is rallying other nations to fight against Edom. But either is possible, but what is clear is this. The nations are rising up against Edom at the same time that God is proclaiming Edom's defeat. And so God is sovereignly summoning the nations to battle against Edom, to bring his judgment upon them. And before we move on, there's one other issue we should address. When did this all happen? What they talk about in the book of Obadiah. Some have suggested that this message was given around the same time as Amos and Jonah. The reason? Simply because it's in the Bible between Amos and Jonah. And so you could say, okay, but that would put it around 760 BC. But this message that we read in the book of Obadiah most likely was given shortly after Jerusalem was destroyed and Judah was taken into exile by the Babylonians. And so that would have been around 586 BC. Now, why would I say that? There's three reasons. First of all, there is an illustration used here in Obadiah, and you'll see it when we read across it, but that it seems to have been borrowed from the book of Jeremiah. They sound very similar. Okay? Secondly, the actions of the Edomites that we read about here in Obadiah fit better with the later date at the time of Jerusalem's destruction. And so the best explanation is that it happened when Jerusalem fell. And you'll see that when we go through it. Thirdly, Psalm 137 supports this idea as well. Psalm 134:7, the beginning of the psalm, in verses 1 and 4, make it clear that the people of Israel were in exile in Babylon when the psalm was written. It says, down by the waters of Babylon, we sing our song. How can we sing a song in a foreign land? So they're in Babylon. But then verse 7 looks back to the destruction of Jerusalem and the taunts of the Edomites, which is what Obadiah talks about. And so this most likely happened after Jerusalem was destroyed and the people of Israel were taken off into exile. Having said all that, let's jump into it. Verse 2. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You shall be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like an eagle, though your nest is among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. So God says that he will make Edom small among the nations. And this isn't just talking about the size of their population or the size of their territory. It's talking about their significance. They won't be thought very highly of by others. The other nations actually will despise and look down on them. Of course, this is ironic because the Edomites think very highly of themselves. They're actually kind of arrogant. And a major source of their arrogance, of their pride, is the place where they live. They believe that they are totally secure because their cities are difficult to get to. So enemies would have a hard time invading them. You see, they live in a natural fortress. They are above tall cliffs. And to get to their cities, you have to travel through narrow, tall passageways in the rock. And so those passageways are very easy to guard. You've probably seen pictures of this area. The city Petra, the rock city Petra, or if you've seen, what was the old movie, Indiana Jones, one of the Raiders of the Lost Ark movies, where he goes into Petra, the city. Anyways, that's the area. The city Petra was built by people later than the Edomites, but that's the area where they lived. It was very easy to defend. And so they thought they lived in an impenetrable fortress, and that they were proud of it. In fact, God says that their pride deceived them into thinking they were safer than they were. They were more invincible than they were. So they said, who will bring us down? Who will bring me down? Because they think no one can. But then God answers their question. He says, I will. I will bring you down. So in their pride, they failed to recognize the greatness of God. But notice that in these verses, there's a play on the ideas of being high and being brought down. So first, it says that they lived high up in the rocks, but they're even compared to the eagles who soar above the earth in the sky. Then they're said to have a nest up among the stars, so even higher. Obviously, this is metaphorical, but that's the idea. It starts with the fact that they live high up on the mountain, above the cliffs. But then he uses this figurative language to illustrate just how highly they thought of themselves. So they did live up high, but they thought they were way up here. Their nest was above the stars. They thought they were untouchable, like stars up in the sky. But they will fall. They will be humbled. God will bring them down. The only true security is God. And if you're going to boast in anything, boast in God. Verse 5. If thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, how you have been destroyed.
Would they not steal enough for themselves? Only enough for themselves? If grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave gleanings? How Esau has been pillaged, his treasures sought out. Now, we just read something like this in Jeremiah 49. He's using the same basic two basic illustrations, basically the same illustrations. There are two of them. Okay. But notice that there's a statement. First he says that if thieves break in, they only take what they want. Okay, they're not going to destroy everything. They're not going to take everything. They're only going to take what they want. But notice that right in the middle of that illustration, there's a statement that interrupts the line. It interrupts the statement about the illustration. It interrupts this illustration, interrupted with this exclamation, how you have been destroyed. It's almost like he couldn't wait long enough to finish the illustration to get those words out. Your destruction is certain. It is coming. It is total. But the point of all of it is that when they are attacked, it will be devastating. Their enemy will show no restraint. But then use the second illustration, and it's when people harvest grapes, they don't pick every grape. They miss some or they leave some on the vines for the poor to pick later, so the poor have something to eat. But unlike those people who harvest grapes that leave a little, unlike that, Edom will be picked clean. In other words, everything will be gone. Verse 7. He continues, all your allies have driven you to your border. Those at peace with you have deceived you. They have prevailed against you. Those who eat your bread have set a trap beneath you. You have no understanding. This may give us a hint as how they got into their impenetrable fortress. But he's saying that even Edom's friends and allies will abandon them. And even worse, they'll deceive the Edomites. They'll defeat them by tricking them. And so these people are close enough friends that they have eaten at their table together. But now they're entrapping them. And when it happens, the Edomites will have no idea. They won't even see it happening or coming. They won't understand what's happening to them or how it all happened. Verse 8. Will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy the wise men out of Edom and understanding out of Mount Esau? And your mighty men shall be dismayed, O Timon, which is a town of Edomites, so that every man from Mount Esau will be cut off by slaughter. So now we see why they don't understand what's happening and how they've been deceived. How are they able to be deceived? It's because God will cause their wisdom to fail. The men of Edom are known for their wisdom, but they won't see this coming at all. But not only will their wise men lose their insight, their ability to understand what's happening, but their great warriors will also become weak, and they will cower in fear, resulting in the Edomites being put to death. And now as we continue reading, we learn what brought this all on. Verse 10. Because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. So why will Edom be attacked and destroyed? Because they are guilty of violence against Israel. This refers not only to physical violence, but also to moral wrong. They have done evil against Israel. And like other times in the Old Testament, here also attention is brought to the fact that Esau or the Edomites are related to Jacob or the Israelites. The suggestion is that the brothers should care for each other, not mistreat each other. But that's exactly what Edom has done through the years. Mistreated Israel. They've opposed their brother
And their evil deeds have brought shame upon themselves, meaning they deserve what's coming to them. They're getting what they deserve. So they will be completely wiped out, and there will no longer be a nation of Edom. Let's look more into this in verse 11. It says, on that day you stood aloof. On that day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. You were like one of them. But do not gloat over the day of your brother in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth in the day of his calamity. Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress. This explains the violence that they did against their relative Israel. And it basically comes out, there's four things here. First, they stood by and watched as Jerusalem was attacked by foreigners. When the Babylonians overran Judah and took all their stuff, the Edomites didn't care. And they did nothing to help them. They didn't help them at all. And that made them just like one of the enemies. So I said, you might as well have been one of them. But even worse, they gloated over their relatives' trouble. They were happy about the people of Judah being mistreated. Israel's defeat was entertainment to them. They just made fun of them and enjoyed the show. But even worse, they took part in the looting of Israel. And so they took advantage of the situation and stole Israel's wealth. They took things from Jerusalem, from Judah. See, they kicked their brother while he was down. And even worse, they stood watch and cut off the escape routes so the people of Judah couldn't get away. They couldn't get away from their attackers, and they even captured the survivors who were trying to escape and handed them over to the Babylonians. Now, there's a couple things that we can take away from this. First of all, God cares about how people treat his people, and he will make things right. And secondly, there is an expectation that family will stand with family, not against them. But even in general, don't gloat over the hardship of others. You know what I mean, it happens. You know, that person who you might think is a little strange, weird, or maybe obnoxious, or whatever it is, but something bad happens to them, and maybe they trip, or they get in trouble at work, or the pen they're using explodes and the ink's got all over them, and you laugh. You gloat. Like, ha, ha, ha. Look what happened to him. Look what happened to her. Or maybe you're just quietly happy that it happened. And you take pleasure in other people's trouble. Be kind, not happy when others experience trouble. Help, don't hurt. So as we continue reading, how will it end? Look at verse 15. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head. For as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so all the nations shall drink continually. They shall drink and swallow, and shall be as though they had never been.
But in Mount Zion there shall be those who escape, and it shall be holy. And the house of Jacob shall possess their own possessions. The house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau stubble, and they shall burn them and consume them, and there shall be no survivor for the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. So he mentions the day of the Lord here. The day of the Lord refers to when God brings his judgment against all the nations. Now, Edom is just one nation, and they have earned the coming judgment by what they have done. But here, Edom is also being used as a representative of all the nations, of all who have opposed God. And so they will all get what they deserve. And this is illustrated by drinking. So the Edomites, they rejoiced and partied because of Jerusalem's destruction. They drank in celebration, but now all of the guilty nations will drink God's wrath. They will become overwhelmed by God's judgment, and they will be wiped out. They'll be completely destroyed. And so it will be like they had never been or never existed. On the other hand, there will be a remnant in Israel that survives. They will be reunited in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will be holy. And we know what this means from other prophecies that we have studied, that it will be holy, it will be sanctified by God's presence, and it will be set apart as a place where God is worshiped. And Obadiah goes on to say that Israel will take back their God-given land. And Israel will come out on top. And he uses this illustration. He says that Israel, they will be like fire that burns the stubble of a field that has been mowed. But Edom will be like that stubble that is burned up. So Israel will completely wipe out the descendants of Esau. And he says Israel will completely wipe out the descendants of Esau. And it will happen because God said it will. Let's keep reading verse 19. Those of the Negev shall possess Mount Esau. Those of the Shephelah shall possess the land of the Philistines. They shall possess the land of Ephraim and the land of Samaria, and Benjamin shall possess Gilead. The exiles of this host of the people of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites as far as Zarephath. And the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Shephard shall possess the cities of the Negev. Saviors shall go up to Mount Zion to rule Mount Zion, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. So this continues the description of the future. So not only will Israel retake possession of their land and fill it, they will also take possession of the land of the Philistines and the Edomites. And he says that saviors or deliverers, leaders, will rule from Jerusalem over Edom. And here Edom is again representing all the nations who oppose God. So all the nations will be ruled from Jerusalem. And the final phrase makes it clear that this is God's rule, that God will rule. This is God's kingdom. Now, by the time of Malachi, which is the last Old Testament prophet, the last book in the Old Testament, by the time of Malachi, Edom was defeated, but they were not completely wiped out. You can read this in the first few verses of the book of Malachi. But the complete destruction that we've just talked about, this complete destruction, and Jerusalem's being made holy, and God's rule over all nations from Jerusalem, this ultimately looks forward to the final judgment of all sinners and the establishment of Christ's kingdom. And there's something abundantly clear from our study in Kings and Prophets, all the things that we've looked at. Only one kingdom will stand forever. We saw Israel fall. We saw Judah fall. We saw Assyria fall. We saw Egypt fall. We saw the Babylonians fall. And judgment was pronounced on all the nations who oppose God and do evil. Only one kingdom is perfectly just and righteous and will stand forever, and that is God's kingdom. And when I was thinking about this, that only one kingdom will last, this verse came to my mind. Matthew 6:33 says, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." Jesus said that our priority in life is to pursue the things of God, to be obedient to God, to be like God in our character, to live to please God and to further his kingdom. And God will take care of the rest. He'll watch over our needs and the things in this life. Ironically, we tend to spend a lot of our time and a lot of our energy pursuing things of this world. Too often, we pursue an earthly kingdom. Too often, we pursue our own kingdom rather than God's. But what will last? Which is more important? Which is most significant? Only one kingdom will stand forever. Pursue it. Seek first the kingdom of God. That's what will last.